30 feet below the Lebanese soil, there is a world that was never supposed to be found. Not a bunker, not a basement, a network reinforced, ventilated, wired for electricity, and stretching for miles under villages, orchards, and roads that ordinary people drive every day. The first serious look came in the summer of 2006. Israeli ground forces pushed into southern Lebanon expecting a conventional fight. What they found instead stopped experienced commanders mid-briefing. Tunnels. Not shallow escape routes dug in a hurry, but engineered passages with concrete-lined walls, steel doors, and chambers large enough to store weapons, house fighters, and run operations for weeks without surfacing. The soldiers were not walking through improvised hiding spots. They were walking through infrastructure. Intelligence agencies had tracked Hezbollah for decades. They knew the organization received money from Iran, weapons through Syria, and political cover from half of Beirut. But the tunnels were different. Tunnels take years. Tunnels take engineers, heavy equipment, and enormous quantities of concrete and steel. Tunnels cannot be delivered in a shipping container or wired in from a foreign capital. Someone had to plan them, fund them, and build them quietly, inside a country with a functioning government, an active press, and foreign observers on the ground. That quiet was the first shock. The second was the depth. Some passages ran 30, 40, even 50 feet underground, deep enough to survive artillery strikes, deep enough to avoid the ground-penetrating radar systems that Israel and the United States had deployed along the border. The builders had clearly studied those detection systems. They had calculated the depth required to stay invisible, and then they went deeper. By the time Israeli forces mapped what they had found in 2006, the picture was already years out of date. The tunnels they entered were not new. The concrete had cured long ago. The electrical conduits were worn. Some chambers showed signs of regular use: food wrappers, spent equipment, maintenance marks on the walls. This was not a network built in anticipation of that particular war. It was a network that had been operational, quietly, for a long time before anyone above ground knew it existed. That realization changed the nature of every conversation that followed, not just about Hezbollah, about what a non-state organization could build in secret under the feet of a watching world. Building a tunnel in secret is not a construction problem. It is a logistics problem, a security problem, and a social problem, all running at the same time. The earth that comes out of a tunnel has to go somewhere. Every cubic foot of excavated rock and soil is evidence. It has mass, it has volume, and it has to be moved, hidden, or explained. Professional tunnel operations generate truckloads of material every single day. In southern Lebanon, that material reportedly disappeared into construction sites, agricultural land, and building projects that provided legitimate cover. A new house going up nearby, a road being graded, a field being leveled. The excess dirt simply became part of the landscape, and nobody asked too many questions. The workers presented a different kind of problem. Tunnel construction requires skilled labor, people who understand soil mechanics, drainage, shoring, and concrete work. Hezbollah solved this partly through loyalty and partly through compartmentalization. Workers knew their section. They did not know the full route. A man who poured concrete in one chamber had no reason to know how far the passage extended in either direction or where it ultimately connected. That kind of compartmentalization is standard in intelligence operations. Applying it to a construction crew was a significant organizational achievement. Materials told their own story. The concrete lining found in the more sophisticated sections required cement, aggregate, water, and reinforcing steel in quantities that would register on any supply chain. Ventilation systems required piping, fans, and power connections. Lighting required wiring and fixtures. Some of this moved through commercial channels under cover of the region's ordinary construction activity. Some of it crossed the border from Syria, mixed into larger shipments of legitimate goods. The supply chain was slow and deliberate, built to avoid the spikes in procurement that trigger monitoring systems. Timing mattered too. The heaviest construction phases appear to have concentrated during periods of relative political calm, when international attention was directed elsewhere and border monitoring was at its most routine. Work slowed or stopped when scrutiny increased, then resumed. Over the course of years, that stop-and-start rhythm produced something that a conventional construction project could never have built quietly, because a conventional project has deadlines, and this one did not. What emerged from that patience was not improvised. It was engineered. Concrete walls, steel-reinforced ceilings, drainage channels cut into the floor, electrical conduits running along the walls. Some sections even had ventilation shafts disguised at the surface as agricultural equipment or ordinary outbuildings. The tunnel was invisible because everything around it was designed to look like something else. The network was never one tunnel. It was a system, with nodes, corridors, dead ends, and redundancies built in from the beginning. The southern tier ran closest to the Israeli border, and that was by design. These passages were tactical. They were positioned to allow fighters to emerge behind Israeli defensive lines, to move rockets and launchers into firing positions without crossing open ground, and to disappear back underground before air assets could respond. The distance between a tunnel exit and the border in some areas was measured in hundreds of feet. In a conflict where response times are counted in seconds, that proximity was the entire point. Further north, the network changed character. The passages grew longer, the chambers larger, and the purpose shifted from tactical movement to strategic storage. Weapons depots were built underground, not small caches, but rooms sized to hold thousands of rockets, organized by type and range. Ammunition stored below ground survives airstrikes that would obliterate the same stockpile sitting in a warehouse. Hezbollah understood this calculation precisely. By the time of the 2006 war, a significant portion of the organization's rocket arsenal was already beneath the surface, untouched by the air campaign above. Command infrastructure followed the same logic. Communications equipment, planning rooms, and leadership positions moved underground during periods of heightened tension. A command center buried 40 feet below a civilian neighborhood is extraordinarily difficult to destroy without causing casualties that generate international pressure. That protection was not accidental. It was the reason those facilities were placed where they were. The geographic spine of the network ran through specific towns and valleys that had served Hezbollah's political base for decades. Bint Jabil, Khiam, Ait al-Shab, and the corridors connecting them toward the Bekaa Valley to the east. These were not random locations. They were chosen because the population in those areas was densely loyal, because the terrain offered natural concealment, and because the road and valley networks provided cover for the surface logistics that fed the underground system. What made the network genuinely dangerous was not any single tunnel or any single weapons cache. It was the redundancy. Destroy one corridor and two others served the same function. Collapse one entrance and the passage could be accessed from a different point half a mile away. The system was designed to absorb punishment and keep functioning. The same principle behind any serious military infrastructure, applied underground, in secret, over the course of 2 decades. A tunnel is only as useful as the people willing to live inside it. The physical conditions underground are hostile in ways that are easy to underestimate from the surface. Temperature stays low and constant, which sounds tolerable until you factor in the humidity. Concrete walls sweat. Drainage channels carry water but cannot eliminate moisture from the air. After 48 hours underground, clothing stays damp. After a week, the smell of mold becomes permanent. Respiratory problems are common among people who spend extended time in unventilated or poorly ventilated underground spaces. Hezbollah's fighters were not enduring this by accident, they trained for it. The ventilation systems installed in the more sophisticated sections of the network were not luxuries. They were operational necessities. Without moving air, carbon dioxide builds to dangerous concentrations within hours in an occupied space. The fans and piping discovered in some tunnel sections were sized to support dozens of occupants continuously, which tells you something about how the spaces were intended to be used. These were not emergency shelters. They were designed for sustained occupation during active conflict. Power came from generators, and generators require fuel. Fuel has to move through the same surface supply chain that fed everything else underground. Some sections ran on stored battery banks for lighting and communications during periods when generator noise could attract attention. The electrical infrastructure found in the more developed chambers was sophisticated enough to run communications equipment, charge radio batteries, power medical equipment, and maintain lighting across large areas. This was not field-expedient wiring, it was installed infrastructure. Medical facilities appeared in the larger nodes. Not full hospitals, but rooms with enough equipment to stabilize wounded fighters before they could be moved. Surgical supplies, IV lines, basic medications. In a conflict where surface movement is constantly observed and attacked, the ability to treat casualties underground without transporting them to a hospital was a significant tactical advantage. It also meant fighters knew that if they were wounded in the tunnels, they would not simply be left there. Food and water storage completed the picture. Some chambers held supplies calculated to sustain a significant number of fighters for weeks without resupply. Quantities found after the 2006 war suggested that Hezbollah had planned seriously for scenarios where surface access was completely cut off, not for days, but for extended periods. What the underground life required, above everything else, was psychological preparation. Fighters who could not manage the darkness, the confinement, and the silence were liabilities. Those who could became something harder to defeat than any surface force. Finding a tunnel you cannot see from the surface is one of the hardest problems in modern military engineering. The basic physics work against the searcher. Ground-penetrating radar sends signals into the earth and reads what bounces back. In theory, a void, an empty tunnel, should produce a detectable signature. In practice, the signal degrades rapidly with depth, scatters through irregular soil layers, and loses resolution in the clay and rock compositions common to southern Lebanon. A tunnel at 30 feet is difficult to confirm. A tunnel at 50 feet, in the right geology, is close to invisible from the surface with conventional equipment. Israel invested heavily in detection technology after 2006. Seismic sensors were deployed along the border to detect the vibrations produced by digging. Acoustic systems listened for the sound signatures of construction equipment operating underground. Aerial surveillance tracked surface anomalies, subtle changes in soil composition, unexplained vehicle patterns near open ground, ventilation outlets disguised as farm equipment. Each of these methods worked sometimes. None of them worked reliably enough to map a network of the scale that had already been built. The United States contributed technology developed partly from its experience with tunnel networks in Vietnam and later in Afghanistan and Iraq. Specialized ground-penetrating systems, sensor arrays designed to detect micro-vibrations, and analytical software that could correlate surface observations with subsurface probability mapping. The tools improved steadily through the 2010s. The gap between what the tunnels could conceal and what detection systems could find was narrowing, but it had not closed. Destruction proved more straightforward than detection once a tunnel entrance was physically located. Specialized bunker-busting munitions were designed to penetrate deep into the earth before detonating, collapsing tunnel sections through shockwave and structural failure rather than direct contact. In 2006, Israel destroyed significant portions of the network it had identified. But identified is the critical word. The sections that were found and destroyed represented a fraction of what existed. Hezbollah lost infrastructure. It did not lose the network. The operations of 2024 changed the scale of destruction significantly. With more precise intelligence accumulated over nearly 2 decades of surveillance, and with munitions specifically engineered for deep underground targets, Israeli strikes collapsed tunnel sections and command nodes at a depth and consistency that 2006 had never approached. Entire corridors that had survived the earlier war were rendered unusable. But even then, the question that followed every strike was the same one it had always been. How much is still down there? The tunnels were never just tunnels. Every strategic choice embedded in that network, the depth, the redundancy, the medical facilities, the weapons storage, the compartmentalized construction, adds up to a single coherent argument. Hezbollah looked at the military advantage that Israel held on the surface and decided to build a different battlefield entirely. One where air superiority means less. One where surveillance has limits. One where a smaller force can survive, resupply, and continue fighting after absorbing strikes that would destroy a conventional army above ground. That argument has not gone unnoticed. Military planners in Washington, Tel Aviv, Seoul, and Taipei have spent years studying what Lebanon demonstrated. The lesson is uncomfortable. A determined organization with patience, engineering knowledge, and enough time can neutralize significant portions of a technologically superior opponent's advantage, not by matching that advantage but by going underground and waiting. The tunnel is the great equalizer of asymmetric warfare, and Hezbollah built the most sophisticated non-state example of it the world had ever seen. The implications extend beyond any single conflict. Hamas studied the Lebanese model and built its own network under Gaza, reportedly stretching for hundreds of miles. North Korea has maintained tunnel infrastructure under its border with South Korea for decades. The pattern repeats because the logic is sound. Underground infrastructure is expensive and slow to build, but it is also expensive and slow to destroy, and it forces the opponent to fight on terms they did not choose. What makes the Lebanese case distinct is the duration. This was not built in response to a crisis. It was built across 2 decades of relative quiet, funded and expanded during ceasefires and political negotiations, while the surface world continued its ordinary business above. The construction happened in a country with a government, with international observers, with journalists, with foreign embassies. And it happened anyway. That is the hardest part of the story to sit with. Not the engineering, impressive as it is, not the tactical implication, serious as they are, but the patience, the willingness to work for 20 years toward an objective that would never appear on any satellite image until it was already complete. Most institutions, governments, militaries, corporations struggle to maintain strategic focus across a single administration. Hezbollah maintained it across generations. The tunnels are damaged now. Some are collapsed, some are flooded, some have been sealed. But the knowledge of how to build them, and the reasons for building them, did not go underground with the concrete. That knowledge is portable, and somewhere, someone is already using it.